فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson number 6, the 6th lesson in our series on Al-Qadr, and it is lesson number 41 overall in our discussion of this book, Taqrib al-Tadmuriyah of Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah. So just as a recap what we've discussed so far, we are speaking about the Qadr of Allah, the Qadr of Allah. And in the first lesson, we defined what this means. We said when we say Al-Qadr, which in English is the divine pre-decree, or Allah's prior determination of all things, and Allah's knowledge of all things prior to them happening. This is what we mean by Al-Qadr, the decree of Allah. Allah's prior knowledge of all that has been and that will be. So after that, we then went on to look at the 4 levels of Al-Qadr. What does it comprise, Al-Qadr? We said that first of all, Allah has prior knowledge of all things. Secondly, that knowledge has been written down in a preserved tablet, in a book. Thirdly, when Allah wills something to happen, He wills it to happen. And fourthly, it comes about by way of His creative power, right? So at the point when something is going to happen, so for example, when a leaf falls from the tree, that is in Allah's prior knowledge and it has been written down. And Allah wills for it to fall at the precise time it falls, and it falls through the creative power of Allah. Right? Allah has put within the creation ways and means, causes and effects. So thus, when the sun departs to the south and the heat is no longer present and the sunlight is no longer present and the vegetation, the trees, whatever, they lose their source of, what gives them life, and they slowly start to degrade and wither, right? All of that is by Allah's creation, by the causes and the effects He placed in the creation. So when any event occurs, that is Allah's act of creation, because He put the ways and means, causes and effects. So when anything happens, it is by Allah's will and it is by His creative power, right? And all of that is what we mean by Al-Qadr. The knowledge, prior knowledge, the writing of that knowledge, everything is written until even the falling of a leaf from a tree, it is written, it's in a book. Thirdly, Allah's will, when He wills for something to happen. And fourth, it is His creative power that led that thing to happen. So He is the creator of all things that happen. And all of those 4 things together, they comprise Al-Qadr, right? So we discussed that in the 2nd and 3rd lesson. Then, in the 4th lesson, we started looking at the asbab, or the ways and the means. And we said that the ways and means are part and parcel of Al-Qadr, the ways and means. And what we mean by the ways and means, the asbab, we mean that when we look at the created things, we see Allah has created entities, beings, things. He has put attributes in those things, and He has put properties in those things. And how Allah's creation functions is by way of those things. So this means that the qadr of Allah, what Allah knows is going to happen, what He's written down is going to happen, what He wills to happen, and what He makes to happen, then it is by way of the asbab, right? So to give you an example, water, for example, Allah created water. Water has many different properties. Water has life-giving properties. Water quenches thirst. Water, there are so many other things, properties and functions of water. So when a person drinks the water, his thirst is quenched. And so Allah made the quenching of thirst to be by way of water, right? And so by extension, to every other thing in the creation which is a cause and which has an effect, then everything that takes place from al-qadr, then it happens by way of the causes and their effects, right? So there are causes and their effects. There are ways and means, which means that we believe in the causes and their effects, right? So we have to believe that Allah created things and those things have properties, and that whatever happens is through those properties, right? So we don't deny the causes, but we do not say that, these causes act independently, because they only act by the permission of Allah, because Allah is the one who gave these properties to things. And nor do we say, on the other hand, that the causes do not have any effect, right? Like we discussed the groups in that lesson. We said, on the one hand, there are some groups like the Ash'aris, they deny the inherent properties of things, right? So they say, for example, if you drink water and then your thirst is quenched, it wasn't the water that quenched your thirst, but it's just that Allah, He created the feeling of your thirst being quenched at the same time to coincide with drinking the water, even though it had nothing to do with the water. That's what they say. This is false. This is not correct, right? Or they would say, for example, the fire, when you have the fire and it burns the wood, it wasn't the fire that burned the wood. It's that Allah created the effect of the burning of the wood to coincide with the fire being present. This is sophistry and foolishness, and we don't believe this is not true, right? Because we believe Allah has indeed put properties in things, inherent properties in things, in molecules, in substances, in whatever. And those properties are part and parcel of the effect, right? So they do play a role in the effect, but they only have the effect by Allah's permission. What do we mean by Allah's permission? We mean that there are other things which also have to be present for that thing to have the effect, right? So without oxygen, there is no fire. In the presence of salt, there is no removal of thirst. So even though things have properties, right, those properties can be invalidated by other things, right? So fire is, if there's no longer any oxygen, the fire will go, right? In the presence of salt, the water is no longer thirst quenching, and so on and so forth. So basically what we are saying here, we are taking the correct position. We are saying that we believe that there are causes and effects, and things which are created have been given properties and qualities by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a result of which effects come to be. But these things are all by the permission of Allah, and there is no ultimate cause except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Every other thing besides Allah needs something other than itself for it to be, or for it to have an effect. And that's true in the creation. There is no thing that we see except that it requires other factors for it to be. For example, a seed, if you leave it on the sill, it's not going to grow by itself. You need it in the soil. But the soil itself is not sufficient. You also need rain. But the rain itself is not sufficient. You need the sunlight. That too is not sufficient. You need the right temperature, which is from spring onwards, right? So all of these things are interconnected. And there's nothing in creation except that it needs other things for it to be. So the only being who is Allah, who is Al-Ghani, the one who is free of all need, right? He is the ultimate cause of all things. So to come to the point, we believe in the causes and their effects. We believe in the inherent properties of things. Things have inherent properties. Those properties indeed cause the effect, right? But not on their own. They only do so because Allah put those properties in there, and when the right factors are combined, then it will have its effect. So we affirm the causes and their effects, and we believe Allah Azza wa Jal is the one who put them there, right? This is different to the materialists, the atheists, the naturalists. What they say is, they say, well, we can explain everything by way of the inherent properties of things. We do not need a creator to explain anything, right? So they claim and they say that, we know how the fire burns, we know how the water quenches thirst, we know the molecular basis of all of that, we know the properties, and so we don't need a creator now to explain because we understand the function of. But this is a sophistry. It's like saying that since we know the mechanics of an engine, then we don't need the creator of the engine, because we understand that one doesn't follow from the other. Just because you understand the mechanics of how a engine works, for example, it does not mean that the engine doesn't have any creator or maker. So in the same way, within biology, within chemistry, within what we study, what we learn, the informational basis of biology, the whole of biology is actually an information science. It's about information. That by necessity means there is a maker, right? And just because you understand the mechanics and the physics of it all does not mean that you can dismiss the creator and the maker who is behind it, right? So basically, there are those who exaggerate in the properties of things and say we don't need a creator to explain the causes and their effects, right? So these are the atheists, the materialists, the naturalists, and in that direction. Then over here you have among the Muslims, those who deny causation in Allah's creation, right? They deny that things have been given properties which then have effects. And they are the Ash'aris, right? Amongst the sects of the Muslims, they are the Ash'aris who deny, that there are things which have the power of causation. So we are in the middle, as we said. So we discussed this in lesson 3 and 4. And in the previous lesson, now all of this is leading to, there's a certain flow and a direction that we are going in. All of this now leads us to, which is where we finished in the past lesson, the issue of man himself, right? So we as humans, because al-qadr, the issue of Allah's decree, and Allah having prior knowledge of our actions, then an issue is raised about, well, if Allah has prior knowledge of our actions and He wills and decrees our actions, how then are we held accountable for these actions? And are we really forced to do our actions, or are we free and are we outside of Allah's will and His power to do as we please, right? So these questions now arise in relation to the actions of men, right? So this is what we're going to discuss. This is the point where we got to in the previous lesson, because we discussed the issue of the causes. So all of that should now be clear, right? With respect to the asbab. So the point that we finished off in the previous lesson is that we said we are basically now moving across a bridge from discussing the causes and their effects in relation to all things besides man, right? Now we are discussing the issue of man and his actions. And the connection between the two is that there is no difference between the things that we've discussed and between man and his will and his power. So let me just illustrate. So we said, let's take water for example. Within water, this molecule, there are certain properties and qualities. Those properties and qualities allow water to perform certain functions, right? The quenching of thirst, the revival of the earth. So when the water comes down into the soil, then there's other factors in the soil. You have bacteria, you have other things, and that enables that function to then eventually lead to life. So just like with water, we treat, and anything else in Allah's creation, we treat man and his properties and his attributes to be exactly the same. Right? The discussion is exactly the same. So the Shaykh says, and this is where we start today's lesson from, إذا كان القدر لا ينافي الأسباب الكونية والشرعية فهو لا ينافي أن يكون للعبد إرادة وقدرة ويكون بهما فعله فهو مريد قادر فاعل لقوله تعالى. So he says, since we know that al-qadar, when we believe in al-qadar, this does not negate that there are asbab, there are causes and effects through which the qadar of Allah comes to be. Right? So just like belief in the asbab, belief in al-qadar doesn't negate the asbab, likewise when we believe in al-qadar, it does not negate the fact that we have a will and we have power by which our actions come to be. In other words, Allah Azza wa Jal has put within our bodies, or He has given us certain attributes, the attribute of will, the irada, the desire to do something, and likewise the qudra, the physical ability to do things. And our actions arise from these two things. When we have a desire and we have the actual ability, then actions will arise from us. And Allah has put these properties within man. Right? And then He mentioned some verses from the Qur'an, minkum man yuridu dunya wa minkum man yuridu al-akhirah. Among you is one who desires the world, and amongst you is one who desires the hereafter. So we have irada, we have the attribute of irada. And likewise, وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ فَعَلُوا مَا يُوعَظُونَ بِهِ لَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُمْ وَأَشَدَّ تَثْبِيتًا. If only they did that which they were admonished with, it would have been better for them. Which shows man is able to do, meaning to act. And مَنْ عَمِلَ صَالِحًا فَلِنَفْسِهِ. Whoever does a righteous deed, it is for his own benefit. Which means man has the ability to do, to act, to work. So these are qualities of man. He has irada, he has fi'l, he has an act, he has amal, he's able to work, do deeds, he has qudra, he has the power and ability. All of these are traits and qualities of man, in the same way that Allah put the quality of hardness in, for example, in steel or metal or in the wood, or just like He put properties in every other thing. This is how He made man, insan, right? He gave him an irada and He gave him a qudra. So after this, the Shaykh goes on to say, لَكِنَّهُ غَيْرُ مُسْتَقِلٌ بِإِرَادَتِهِ وَقُدْرَتِهِ وَفِعْلِهِ. However, man is not independent in his will and his power and his action, in the same way that all the other asbab that we discussed, right? كما لا تستقل الأسباب بالتأثير في مسبباتها. Just in the same way as all the other causes, like we discussed, they are not independent in having their effect, right? So just like we said, if you take a seed and you plant the seed, we have the seed, we have the soil. But without other things, you are not going to have any vegetation. So you have to have water. And water is from the creation of Allah. And you have to have the sun and its light and its warmth, which is also from the creation of Allah. So the seed, even though it has inherent properties within it of, the DNA or the RNA or whatever, however the system works, the information for it to become what it is going to become, right? Even though that has all that stuff in there, it still needs other things from Allah's qadar, from the other things Allah created for it to actually have the effect, right? So it cannot be independent in its effect. You can't put a seed on the windowsill and expect it to give you, vegetation and whatever, 2-3 months down. It's not going to happen, right? So in the same, in exactly the same way, Allah has put within man the irada and the qudra, the will and the ability through which his act comes to be. But he is not independent in his ability to act, right? He can only act if Allah allows through other means for him to act. And he will only have the desire, the will to do something if Allah allows through other means for him to actually have the will to do something, right? So as Allah says in the Qur'an, لِمَنْ شَاءَ مِنْكُمْ مَنْ يَسْتَقِيمُ وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَنْ يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. You will not will, for whoever amongst you wills to be upright, but you will not will except as Allah wills, the Lord of the worlds. Right? So, because we know the irada, the will, and the qudra, the power, these are a man's attributes. And a man is created, therefore his attributes are also created. So if he's created and his attributes are created, then everything he does is also a creation of Allah. Right? So from this discussion, what the important thing is to understand that just like we discussed all the other created things, right? Like water, like the air, like rock, like stone, like fire, every other entity which is inanimate, it has properties, it has qualities, it has functions, then man is exactly the same, right? He also is created, and he also has attributes, traits and qualities through which his action and his function comes to be, right? However, just like the other things, he cannot do, he cannot act, he cannot will, except that Allah wills and Allah, allows that to happen. So meaning that man is completely under the knowledge, the will, and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He does not exit from that. Nothing comes outside of that, right? And so we affirm that he actually does have the will and the power to do things, and we affirm that all of that actually is from the will and the power of Allah, just like with everything else. So, so the Shaykh, okay, now let's just pause at this point. Let's stop at this point now before we go further, and let's just make sure that we understand the right thing. So basically, let's go back now. So as we said before, there's three groups. There's one group here who's negating the causes and their effects, right? So here we have the Ash'aris who are saying, when you drink the water, it's not the water that's quenching the thirst. The water is just coincidental. But Allah has created His creation in such a way that when you drink the water, Allah will, in real time, create the feeling of quenching the thirst to coincide with you drinking the water, right? But it had nothing to do with the water. It's Allah creating the actual quenching of thirst. The reason why they are saying this is because they wrongly believe that if we give any power or property to the water, we've now claimed that there is a power other than the power of Allah. This is false reasoning. It's not true, right? Because Allah is the one who put the power in this in the first place. So even if this thing has the effect, it is Allah who's the creator of the effect. So that's redundant, right? So they are over here, right? Then over this side on this side we have the naturalists, the atheists, the materialists, and what they are saying, well, we can explain everything by the inherent properties of things. We don't need a creator to explain anything. So because we know water, the molecule H2O has a certain property, has a certain shape, has certain qualities, we now know and understand how it does whatever it does, right? So because we understand that, we can explain everything by the inherent properties of things. We don't need a creator. This is also false because, the properties of things have been endowed with properties. Right? So there has to be one who gave the properties. Right? So they are on this side. Now, moving on from that and putting man and his actions and having the same discussion to do with man and his actions, then we also have three groups. Right? So we have over this side here, we have the Jahmiyyah and the Ash'aris, and what they are saying in relation to man and his actions, that man does not have any ability or any power to do anything. He is forced to do what he does. Right? So they are denying that we have free will and the ability and the power to do our actions, right? So they're basically saying it's like, when you have a leaf and the wind blows, the leaf has no choice but to just move in the wind, right? Right? This is how a man is, right? Allah has decreed things upon him. Those things are going to happen whether he likes it or not, right? And they don't happen by way of his will or his choice. He's forced to do what he does, right? This is on this side here. Then on the other extreme, on the other side, there are the Mu'tazila. And what they say is that man and his actions are completely outside the domain of Allah's will and his power. Meaning that what we do, it's not Allah who's willing it or creating it. So we are completely outside of the control and the power of Allah Azza wa Jal. We are doing things completely independently with our own will and with our power. It's outside of Allah's. So meaning that there is within this creation things over which Allah has no power. Do you understand? Meaning Allah has no power over our actions. So we are outside of Allah's creative power. Right? So these are mistakes when it comes to man and his actions, right? And this mistake follows on from the mistake in relation to the material causes and their effects that we just discussed, right? They're making the same mistake. What we should be saying, what the correct view and position is that it is Allah Azza wa Jal. Allah gave us the will and the power. He gave us these properties, and therefore, because these are our attributes, and our attributes are created just like we are created, then everything we choose and we do, then it is within the will and the creative power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We never ever are outside of Allah's creative power, right? So yes, our actions are by our will and our power, but that will and power has been endowed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just in the same way as the water quenches the thirst because it has some inherent properties and powers, but those inherent properties and powers have actually been endowed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So there's no issue and there's no problem in affirming any of that. Okay, so the Shaykh goes on to elaborate upon this issue. So he says, وَهَؤُلَاءِ الْجَبَرِيَّ يَقُولُونَ لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِرَادَةٌ وَلَا قُدْرَةٌ وَلَا فِعْلٌ لأنك لو أثبت له إرادة وفعلا وجعلت فعله نتيجة لإرادته وقدرته لكنت كافرا بالقدر. Meaning, so those people who say, well, we can't say that a man has a will and a power, because if you were to say that, you've now denied al-qadr. You've denied al-qadr. Right? But this does not follow. This does not follow. If I say that in this water is the power to quench thirst, I have not denied al-qadr, because Allah is the one who put that in there. He decreed for that power to be in there. How can you say I'm a denier of al-qadr? Right? If I say, like, if Allah has decreed before creating the creation that a certain man at a certain time in a certain place, he will be thirsty, and then he drinks the water and he the thirst is quenched by that water. How can you say that if I say, well, the water has been given certain properties and qualities by which thirst is quenched, how can you now say I've denied al-qadr? How have I denied al-qadr? Well, I haven't denied al-qadr, because what I'm saying is that yes, Allah decreed before He created the creation that that man at that time, at that place, his thirst is going to be quenched, but it's going to be by water, which Allah put the property of quenching thirst, and he drank it, and the thirst was quenched. How have I denied Allah's prior knowledge, or Him writing it down, or Him willing it, or Him bringing it about? How have I denied that? Because, as we said, all of what happens in creation is by way of the ways and the means. The ways and the means are part and parcel of al-qadr. Right? They do not negate al-qadr, but al-qadr happens by way of the ways and the means, the asbab, right? So this is their argument, and the Shaykh goes on to obviously refute this kind of argument, and so as we said, he goes on to discuss like the three groups: those who say the causes have no effects at all. They are the Ash'aris over here. And then there are those who exaggerate and they say everything happens only through the causes, by the inherent powers of causes. They are the atheists and the naturalists and people like that. But when it comes to the actions of men, then we have one group over here that denies man has any will and power. Not independent, but he has any will and power through which his actions come to be. They are the Ash'aris. And over here you have the Mu'tazila, who say man creates his own actions. They are outside of Allah's will and His control. They are the Mu'tazila. They are the Mu'tazila. Okay, so moving on from that point, to conclude this point, what do we say then in conclusion? We say that the properties Allah put in things, they do have an effect, right? But that effect is subject to the permission of Allah, to the will of Allah, so it's not independent in having its effect, right? So that's the basic point that we are making, right? So anyway, this is the first point of today's lesson, right? That we understand man and his qualities and his actions, we treat it to be the same as all the other causes and their effects. There's no difference. We now move to the second issue now. Okay, so the second issue that's connected to this is that the qadr is from Allah, right? So we know that everything that happens is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how can you say al-qadr khayruhu wa sharruhu, right? So part of our belief, the 6 pillars of belief, is to believe in Allah, in His angels and His books and His messengers, and al-qadr khayruhu wa sharruhu, right? The good and the evil of al-qadr, the good and the evil, and then the last day. So a question arises: how can you say the good and the evil. Okay, we understand the good, that Allah decrees the good. But as for when you say the evil, then how can this be? How can there be, how can there be evil in Allah's decree, in what Allah decrees? Right? So now this is a second issue that we're going to discuss in today's lesson. Before I move on, is there anything, any question related to the first, to do with man's actions? Is that all clear? Yeah.
What did they say about the intention, before you actually do the action?
Yeah.
Do you think that that's great separately as
well? Well, yes, that's outside. According to the Mu'tazila, they say that is outside of Allah's creative power. So when the man has the irada and he has the intention to do something, it has to come completely from himself, outside of Allah's control and power. Right? Because the reason why they're saying this is because they are saying, how can Allah punish and reward if He is the one who's creating the actions, if He's the one who's decreeing the actions upon mankind? So this means that everything to do with the action, meaning your intention to do it, your desire for it, and you actually doing it, all of it has to come from the servant himself in order for it to be justice, for Allah's reward to be justified, right? So all of that, they consider that to be outside of Allah's creative power. Anything to do with the act itself. Yeah.
The other end as well, Sheikh?
Yeah. Well, the other end, what they do, the way they explain it, is they say, well, man doesn't really have any free will or free choice, but how is he going to be rewarded? Right, so what they say, they come out with this doctrine, and they say, well, because Allah chose this person and his body through which the act was performed, the sin or the righteous deed, Allah will give him the credit. Right, so it's as if Allah is acting through that body, but He just gives that body the credit or the negative mark for the sin or the act of obedience. You understand? So this is how their notion of how do you earn good, how do you earn reward and punishment, right? So to those people over here, they say, well, no, we have to earn it completely outside of Allah's creative power. We are the ones who have to create it ourselves, right? These over here are saying, no, Allah is the doer of everything. But because He chooses to do the deed of righteousness through this body or that body, that will gain a credit. That will gain like a point, so to speak, right? So this is how that person will get rewarded, because Allah chose to do the action through the decree through that person's body. It's in a way they're saying you are forced to do what you are doing, but because your body was the instrument through which that was done and decreed, you will just get a credit for it. You will get like a reward for it. So it's just philosophical. They're trying to reconcile these things without. But in the middle, what we say is, Allah created us, gave us the will, gave us the power. Then we choose to do what we do after Allah has sent us the messengers. Do you understand? Right? Reward and punishment is justified by way of the sending of the messengers. Right? That's how it's justified. So we'll come to that a bit later in the lesson. But yes, to answer your question, everything that comes from the servant in relation to the act, then they consider that to be outside of Allah's creative power. Right? So we'll discuss that later, inshallah, as to why they say that. Okay, so if there's no more questions on that issue, let's move to the second issue. The second issue then is to do with al-qadr, the good and the evil. So how can you say there's evil in the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Okay, to explain this point, then some of this stuff is a bit technical because there's Arabic terms. Ash-shar laysa fil qada walakin fil maqdi. Right? That evil, when we speak of evil, It is not in Allah's decree, but it is in what Allah has decreed. Right? So I know this is going to be a bit hard to distinguish in your mind. So I want to give you an example. So let's say shaitan, for example. Shaitan, the devil. Right? Shaitan is evil. Is evil. Shaitan is from the creation of Allah. Right? Shaitan is from the decree of Allah. Right? Allah decreed for there to be shaitan. Allah decreed for there for there to be Iblis and shaitan. So he's evil, but in the act of Allah, in Allah's action of creating shaitan, is there evil? Right? So can you make that distinction between those two things? Right? There is the action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in creating shaitan, and there's Allah decreeing shaitan to be. Is there any evil in Allah's act of decreeing and creating? The answer is no. Right? So this is Allah's qadr. This is Allah creating. This is Allah's action now, right? Is there any evil in that? The answer is no. And that's because in everything Allah does, in everything Allah creates, there is a wisdom, there is a benefit, there is a goodness, like an eventual goodness, right? So there's nothing in the decree of Allah, whatever Allah has decreed, that is evil. There's nothing in the qadr of Allah in which there is evil. However, in what Allah, in the thing being decreed, in the thing which is maqdur, and the thing which is maqdi, right? So the thing created, the thing decreed, right? In that thing, there can be evil, right? From one angle, from an angle, right? So if you can distinguish that in your mind, if you distinguish between Allah's act of creating and Him decreeing, we can never ever say there's no evil in any of that, right? So whether it is Allah creating shaitan, Allah creating pain, for example, or suffering, for example, or illness, for example, or death, for example, or poverty, for example, right? In all of these things, in relation to us, these are evils in relation to us. Why? Because we feel pain, we feel suffering, we feel physical harm, we don't like these things, it's evil for us. So this is evil in that sense. But in Allah creating these things and decreeing these things, there is no evil at all. Rather, there is far-reaching wisdom. Why? Because without pain, how would we know what is pleasure? Without poverty, how would we know what is riches and affluence? Without good health, how would we know? Without illness and pain and suffering, how would we know what is good health? Right? So in Allah's act of creating all of these things and Allah decreeing these things, there is only goodness and perfect wisdom, right? And that's why we see in a supplication that al-khair wal-khair kulluhu biyadayk, right? Goodness, all of it is in your hands. All of goodness is in your hands. وَالشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ. And the evil is not ascribed to you. Right? So we cannot ever ascribe evil to Allah, even though evil exists in His creation. Right? So you need to make that distinction clearly in your mind. Evil can never be ascribed to Allah in the sense that is there anything in the decree of Allah, what He decrees, his act of decreeing, his act of creating, is there anything in those actions which is evil? No. There can never be any evil in the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But in what is created, in what is decreed, there can be evil, but it's only evil in relation to us. Right? So we see pain and suffering as an evil. We see, we see shaitan and the shayateen to be evil, and indeed they are evil. But there's also wisdom and goodness, in the sense that through shaitan and through the shayateen, the people of Iman are distinguished between the people of kufr. And, it is the way by which Allah tests and puts people to trial. So there are wisdoms in what Allah has created. Right? So therefore we cannot ascribe to the act of Allah, evil. But evil is found within the creation. The Shaykh goes on to give some examples that even the evil that occurs in this creation, it is not actually absolute evil. Right? This is not absolute evil. Rather, there is actually some benefit as well. So he gives the example. He says, for example, when we see other people who are suffering, for example, for their sins, and you will now take an admonition, right? You take an admonition, you take a lesson, you keep away from the things that individual has been doing, right? Maybe someone is gambling, maybe someone is fornicating, maybe someone is stealing and cheating, right? So they get caught, or they face humiliation, or they get punished, or whatever. So you now take that as, this is a decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are evils. But now this benefits you in the sense that you now take an admonition from these things, and you inhibit yourself from these sins. Right? And similarly, there are many things from Allah's decree, as the Messenger said, "Ma yusibul Muslim min nasabin wala wasabin wala hammin wala huznin wala adhan wala gham hatta shawka yushakuha illa kaffar Allahu biha min khatayah." There is nothing which afflicts a Muslim of any kind of poverty, any kind of hardship or pain or suffering or anxiety or sadness or harm or kind of gloominess or anything like that, until even when he's pricked by a thorn, except that Allah expiates of his sins by way of that. Right? So even though these things are evils in relation to us, they are evil from an angle in the sense that they are painful, we don't like them, but nevertheless there is some khair, which is the expiation of sins. So this means that in Allah creating these things, right? So you have like prickly thorns and things like that, and you have anxiety and grief and sadness and all sorts of things that harm you physically or mentally or emotionally or whatever, and the believer undergoes these things. In Allah creating those things, there is no evil. Rather, there is perfect wisdom, and in fact there is mercy, because through these things the believer is washed and cleaned and purified of his sins and of his shortcomings. So they are actual goodness, and there is wisdom in their creation, and this is nothing but khair, goodness, as it relates to Allah's decreeing of these things and creating these things. But in relation to us, they are evil from one angle, from an angle, not evil in the absolute sense. Right? So the Shaykh then goes on to give another example. He says, and he explains that, look, these things are expiation of sins, and when a calamity befalls you, like an illness or something, your sin is removed, but when you have patience, you then earn a good deed on top of the sin being removed. Right? So here is the wisdom in all of this, right? So, physically you are stung, or there's a nettle or something, and it's irritating. for days or something, okay, that's now the physical pain and whatever. This is sins being removed. But if you now have patience, you have sabr, and you don't complain, you don't become angry, and you have sabr, this now is an additional good deed on top of that, right? For which you are rewarded. So all of these things which we perceive to be evil, illness, death, poverty, hunger, whatever, yes, they are evil from an angle, but they are beneficial from another angle. And in Allah creating those things, there is goodness and there is wisdom, which is why evil can never approach Allah. Evil can never be ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Shaykh goes on to give the example of al-marad, mithalu dhalik al-marad. So from the angle of a man, what does an illness do? An illness, gives him pain. He stops him from doing his beneficial interests, like working and things like that. And he will consider it to be an evil. But from the angle that when a person falls ill, he realizes how weak he is as a person, and how easy he can succumb to illness and die. Right? He will now recognize the favor and the bounty of Allah upon him. He will recognize the favor of good health, the bounty of good health, and he will realize that this is an expiation for his sins, and it will raise his ranks if he has patience. Then all of these things now prove that what was decreed for him was actually goodness, not evil. Right? And that's why we now go back to that hadith that we mentioned. Right? Indeed, the affair of the believer, in all of it, is khair, is goodness. Right? If something pleasing comes to him, he is grateful, and that is better for him. And if something harmful afflicts him and comes to him, then he has patience, and that is better for him. And this is not for anyone other than the believer. Right? So all of the affair of the believer, therefore, is goodness, because he knows that nothing from the decree of Allah is actually evil, like absolute evil for him. Rather, all of it is goodness, because everything, every calamity, every hardship, every pain, every suffering, every grief, anxiety, it's simply a means for him to become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to distinguish between al-qadar and al-maqdur. Right? What's the difference? Al-qadar is Allah's act. Allah's act of decreeing things and creating things, right? Good or evil in relation to us, right? So we have to distinguish between that and between the maqdur, the thing created, right? In which there can be good and there can be evil. And the qada and the maqdi, right? The thing determined, Allah's action of determining, and the thing determined. We make a distinction between these things. So, as far as the thing decreed and the thing created, then it can be evil. As Allah Azza wa Jal, He says in the Qur'an, وَنَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ. That we shall put you to trial by way of evil and by way of goodness as a tribulation, and to us shall you be returned. So here Allah said, put to trial by way of evil. So there is evil, but it's in this creation, and by way of goodness. Right? So evil and goodness are in the creation. That's why we say al-qadar khayruhu wa sharruhu. Al-qadar is good and it's evil. Meaning the thing being decreed, not the action of Allah in decreeing it. And after this, the Shaykh goes on to say, after he discusses this and makes that clear, he then goes on to say that when we look at the people are of 4 levels when it comes to the things which are decreed. Right? So, in relation to the things which are decreed to happen, first of all, we have been ordered to be pleased with those things. This is mustahab, to be pleased. To have patience is wajib, and to become angry against those things is haram, and to be grateful is actually the highest level. right? So basically there are 4 responses or 4 positions that we can have towards the things which are decreed in Allah's creation, right? There are 4 things. You can either be pleased, which is something which is mustahab. So for example, you suffer some pain, you have an illness, you are pleased with that, right? This is desirable. Or you can have patience, and you can have patience. To have sabr is actually something which is wajib in the Sharia. To be patient with all hardships and calamities. To become angry, you became angry that you suffered poverty or suffered pain. To have anger, this now is unlawful. It's haram to actually have that anger. And as for being grateful, having shukr, this is something that is the highest rank or the highest degree, the best believer. And so the Shaykh says, therefore, in light of this, when we look at all the people, all the Muslims in relation to the things which are decreed upon them, we find that they are divided into 4 categories. There are 4 levels of people. The first level is, the Shaykh says, a person becomes angry, an yakuna sakhitan, right? He becomes angry that this hardship or this calamity has come. And in relation to this, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu, he said, la'ana Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam an-na'iha wal-mustami'ah. Right? Allah has cursed the woman who wails over the dead. When you start wailing, you start screaming and shouting and, going overboard. Wal-mustami'ah. And the one who is there listening to this woman and encouraging her and participating in the, you see women do this, right? Someone dies in the family, they get together. One woman loses her mind, starts screaming, shouting, crying, wailing, slapping herself, and then the others start, doing the same thing. These women are cursed, right? These women are cursed. They are, being cursed means that you are made far, far away from Allah's mercy. This is the meaning of being cursed. So this is a display of anger towards Allah's decree. Someone passed away, it was Allah's decree. You're not showing any patience, right? This is you are anger against Allah's decree. So this now is prohibited. It's prohibited, and Allah cursed this type of thing. In this particular example, to do with death, meaning wailing. The second type of person, or the second level, an yakuna sabiran, is that instead of becoming angry, you accept it and you are patient. So you are now patient. And أن يتحمل المصيبة ويتصبر مع الكراهية لكنه لا يغضب على الله فهذا صابر والصبر واجب. Right, so this person now is patient, and even though he dislikes the calamity, this is natural. You don't like that someone has died. You don't like that you have harm, like an illness that's hard to bear. You don't like poverty, loss of wealth, loss of riches, because it's hard to bear. You don't like that. Yes. You're not forced to, but you are patient nevertheless. Still, you are patient, you show patience, you don't complain, So here, it is wajib to show patience, right? Meaning not to become angry, not to express this anger verbally, right? This is not the same as disliking the calamity. Yes, you can dislike the calamity, because this is natural. But anger, not becoming angry, this is what is unlawful. So you have to distinguish between anger towards the thing happening and dislike of the thing happening, right? Now the third type of person is the one, as the Shaykh says, an yakuna radiyan. That there's a third type of person who's actually happy and satisfied with the thing that happened, meaning that he doesn't have hatred or dislike of what happened like we have in the second level. Here the person now is actually happy, right? So it could be an illness, could be loss of wealth, could be some pain inflicted, maybe it could be a bite or a sting or something like that, could be a death even. So he thinks about it, and obviously he's showing patience, and instead of disliking the thing that happened, He actually likes the thing that happened. He's pleased and he's satisfied and he's happy because he can see the benefit to him and his well-being in this life and the next. So it could be, for example, a person maybe has lost some wealth. Okay, so then he thinks about it and thinks, well, if I had that wealth, I would have squandered it maybe on unlawful things. I may have been put to trial by way of that wealth. I may have done things which are haram with that wealth. So in a way, I'm happy that happened and now I'll move on and, whatever, right? So here now the person actually has pleasure. He's pleased with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This now is the third level, that you are pleased with the decree of Allah after having patience and obviously not becoming angry, right? The fourth level goes beyond that, and here this is when a person an yakuna shakiran. He's actually not just pleased, he's actually grateful. He's actually grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that calamity. أن يكون شاكرا أي مع الصبر والرضا. So on top of being pleased with that decree and having sabr, right, he is also in fact grateful to Allah. فيزداد ثناء على الله ويحمده على هذه المصيبة. And so he praises Allah, he thanks Allah, he's grateful to Allah. This is the highest level, right? He's actually grateful for that calamity, right? Some people, they go through calamity and they realize and they think, this is a wake-up call for me. It could be a death in the family, it could be some illness, it could be some loss of wealth, it could be something, and he thinks, this has really opened my eyes. I have to be grateful to Allah that Allah, through this calamity, Allah has shown me the reality of this life, of the world, that this world is just really nothing, and it wakes people up. So they are truly grateful to Allah that they have been made to suffer this particular calamity. So they go beyond the level of sabr, beyond the level of ar-rida, of being pleased, and they are actually grateful to Allah for this. So this brings us to the end of the second point. So what we are doing here is, in the flow of the discussion, we finished discussing the asbab, the material and the physical causes and their effects. We discussed that issue and how all of that is part and parcel of al-qadr. It's not outside of al-qadr. By extension, man and his actions are exactly the same, right? Man and his actions are exactly the same. Just like Allah created physical essences and gave them their properties, in the same way Allah created man and gave him his qualities and his attributes. He made man to be one who wills and one who acts, alongside other things. فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. We made man to be hearing and seeing. Allah made man to be hearing and seeing and knowing and willing and acting. Allah made man to be like this. All of that is within al-qadr. It's part and parcel of al-qadr, right? So man is neither forced to do his actions, nor does he do his actions outside of the will and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is within Allah's will and power. He's within al-qadr. He does not go outside of al-qadr, right? So we cleared that point. Then the second point we are discussing now in today's lesson is the issue of good and evil, right? So how do we explain the issue of evil? And the answer to this is that in Allah's action of decreeing everything, there is no evil whatsoever. All of it is wisdom, because in all of Allah's actions, what He wills, what He decrees, what He brings to be, there is nothing but wisdom and goodness, right? Until even in the creation of things that we see to be evil, in the creation of shaitan, iblis, the devil, in the creation of what we perceive to be evil, like death and pain and hunger and grief and anxiety and all those other things, the creation of those things, there is wisdom and goodness in their creation, even though in relation to us they are perceived as evil, Right? So we have to make that distinction between al-qada wal-maqdi, al-qadar wal-maqdur. There's a distinction between Allah's act of willing and creating and decreeing, and between the thing decreed and willed and brought about. In fact, some of the scholars they give an example, or they give a similitude. They say, for example, there's a surgeon who needs to operate upon you, right? So the action of the surgeon in cutting you open and so on and so forth, right? As it relates to you, the recipient, that's an evil, because you are receiving what is painful, what is whatever. But in the actual action of the surgeon, his actual action, there is nothing but goodness for you, because it is life-saving for you, right? It's going to benefit your health, and it's going to save your life in some cases, right? So there's evil from one angle, but there is benefit. So in the action there's benefit, the action of the surgeon, but for you as the recipient there is evil. Right? So some scholars do give that example, but inshallah the point itself should be very, very clear. And that leads us now, there's actually a third point that we're going to discuss on this issue. And this now leads us to the issue of, the argument of al-qadr. How do you, people who use the argument that if Allah has decreed these things, He knows these things and decreed these things, then how am I held accountable? And how am I held responsible? So some people use Allah's decree as an argument to justify their evil actions. That's the third thing that we're going to discuss, inshallah, in the next lesson. But here in today's lesson, we will suffice with the discussion of these two things, inshallah ta'ala. So keep in mind that there's an actual flow to this whole discussion, and there's a certain sequence, a certain order in which we are discussing these particular things, in which they've been arranged in this book, to help us grasp the issues, sequentially, step by step, right? So with that, we'll conclude today's lesson. If there is any questions on anything that we've discussed, feel free to ask, inshallah, before we conclude.
Can you repeat how would we understand then the statement of Rasul where he said the qadr of the good of it and the bad of it? So how do we understand what's meant by the bad of it?
How do we distinguish between the good and the bad?
Not distinguish, but how do we understand what's meant by the bad of it?
The bad of it is just like we said. So the question is, how do we know the good from the bad in relation to al-qadr? Yeah. Okay. Well, there's two things here: that which relates to the creation, that which relates to the Sharia. So, in terms of the thing decreed, we know that shirk, polytheism, kufr, disbelief, sin, disobedience, all of these things are evils, right? They are things which take place within Allah's creation, which are actual evil. Even though in Allah's act of creating those things, as we said before, there are wisdoms, and we don't ascribe that evil to Allah's act. So those things are very, very clear. It's very simple. Whatever opposes the Sharia, then we know that to be evil, for it to take place in the creation, even though Allah allows it to take place, but that's for a wisdom. Then there are the worldly things, which we know to be evil, such as disease, death, poverty, hunger, all things which bring harm and pain and suffering physically or otherwise. Then in relation to us, they are evils, So what is the good from what is evil is very straightforward and simple. In relation to al-qadr, it is whatever opposes the Sharia, that is an evil, and whatever obviously brings harm to mankind, physically, to their wealth or to their physical being or whatever, then those obviously we all agree that these are evils, right? So that's all there is to it. So that would be the shar, the evil, that has been decreed within the creation. Yeah. Okay, inshallah, we'll stop there for today, and in the next lesson, as we said, we'll then start discussing the important issue of looking at the arguments people use to justify. These are sinful Muslims who will justify their actions by saying, well, Allah decreed it upon me, Allah decreed this sin upon me, what can I do? So we look at that in some detail, inshallah. We will look at the arguments used and how they have been refuted in the Qur'an and in the Sunnah, and also by way of reason. So that will be for the next lesson, and so we'll conclude today's lesson there. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.